Hello there and welcome. In this video I'm going to be doing the ink portion with a dip pen. This particular dip pen has got what's called a crown nib. It has a very fine squared off end. It's about 1mm broad. It's actually a bit on the thick side for drawing. It's ideal for writing, copperplate type writing. But I am going to use it for drawing because it's very flexible. And because it's very flexible, it imparts a certain kind of energy to the line. It gives the line a sharp, jagged quality that's difficult to describe and damn near impossible to get with any other tool, any other material at all. I've heard it said that the tools don't matter, but I don't believe that, because I don't think it's possible to get this exact type of line quality with anything else. It's got to be a dip pen, it's got to be a flexible dip pen, and this is a good example of a flexible dip pen. So here on my tape up there, if I press with no pressure at all, it makes a fairly predictable line. Not too heavy, not too light. Because it's a squared nib, if I use it to make a sideways motion, which, you know, it's sideways relative to the nib, that makes a very fine line. And if I press harder with that, the fine line doesn't get any less fine. So that is an ideal line for hatching to make tone and shade. And if I use it with a little bit more pressure and a varying amount of pressure, I can go from fine to quite thick. And because it's a flexible, bouncy, resilient nib, I can scribble with it. I can that quality of it imparts something that is just not available by other means I'm aware of. So here we go. This is another portrait in the series of Orc portraits. This one is more of a fairy tale or probably something that would fit in the Lord of the Rings universe. Right. I'm just starting where I know I'm going to have relatively thick lines, because one of the disadvantages of a dip pen, of any dip pen, but especially the kind that deposits a lot of ink at one time, is it can take a good bit of time for the ink that you lay down to dry. And you just have to live with that. One of the ways to live with that is do your thick lines first, because your thick lines will take longer to dry than your thin ones. If you do them first, your overall drying time is reduced, because you don't have downtime so much at the end. So you can see I've transitioned here from a thick line to little dots quite rapidly. And that's going to be, what do you call that? I've heard it be called, it's like these burst blood vessels in folks' noses that you get, and it's like, you get rosacea, I think. You know, like your classic rosy nose. It comes with this orange peel texture. When I lived in Aberdeen, I saw loads of folk like that who had this condition. It's a sort of deformity. I think historically it was viewed as a deformity that happened just as a result of age, but it's strongly associated with alcohol. I don't think it's necessarily caused by alcohol. I'm sure there's people who get such a thing without having to do a lot of drinking. But anyway, so given this bulbous nose, that kind of orange peel texture, so you can see here there's a jump from a thin line to a thicker one, and again, thicker again. And I can just jump all over the place. I like this lively, rich line quality a lot. And I tend to then use a brush to do the fills. The fills of black. I can indicate them like this, where I want to fill in later an area of hatching with a boundary. Which I also think is ideal for doing a halftone. I like using dip pens a lot. There's something about them. And I like writing with them too. The tactile feedback that you get from them is it's a wee pleasure in and of itself. This kind of flexibility, although I do use goose quills, you don't get this kind of flexibility with anything but a metal nib. There we go, a knitted hat. I'm thinking vaguely of, there's a creature called a red cap. It's a creature from mythology in the Scottish borders. It inhabits abandoned buildings, old farms, what have you, and preys on travellers. It waits till they sleep and then it murders them in their sleep and dips its hat in their blood to give it immortality. So, although in Dungeons and Dragons a red cap and an orc are very different things, mythology is all wishy-washy, and Dungeons and Dragons does not own all mythology everywhere, no matter how much they'd like to. There we go. Right, I'm going to give this a quick blast with the heat gun, and then I can erase and we can start the watercolours. Okay, here we go again for the watercolour. And I've given this a quick blast with my heat gun. It took about a minute to dry all of the ink. I live in a cold country, Scotland being famously cold and damp. It isn't the coldest country in the world, but my house doesn't have heating. Didn't have a central heater. I've got electric panel heaters and I don't have enough money to run them, so my house is always very cold. For Americans, you should imagine that my house is on average about 55 degrees Fahrenheit. For folk in the UK, that's about 11 centigrade. And that's all the time, and it's damp. So watercolour takes a long time to dry, ink takes a long time to dry, and the heat gun I've lived without for many years, and now that I have one, it's essential to me, because otherwise it would take all the rest of the day for that ink to dry. And instead I can get it knocked out in a minute and continue this video in a sensible and timely fashion. Oh, my dog is moving the board. Oops, dropped a brush. Oh well, that's a problem for later. Right, so here's my watercolour palette, handily distinguished from any other palette by writing the word watercolours on it. Oops, zoomed out too far. Got white gouache, black watercolour paint, various yellows, yellow ochre, various reds. I think that's a free space, dark blue, light blue, browns, blob of green. I keep it in more or less the same order all the time. But if I ever want to change it, it's just as simple as just washing the thing, which is always easy to do. A watercolour just comes off just like this. And giving your palette a wee clean before you get started, always a good idea. Because you want to start with light colours, and if you have dark colours left on your mixing part of your palette, you're going to get contaminated light colours, which is livable with. It's not really a problem. There's ways around most things, but why make your life any harder than it has to be? So, because I've been doing a green orc, I thought I might try something different, and I might try, I don't know, kind of a yellowy brown colour. So I'm starting with this very dilute pale yellow. This is called gamboge hue. And I heard this described once as defeating the colour white on your page, just by filling in all the areas. I don't do this for fine art painting. This is definitely a technique that's best suited for illustration painting, I think. Fine art painting, I would leave areas of white. But in illustration, for some reason, it doesn't look as good. Right? When you scan them, it looks overexposed, and it doesn't look right. So, there we go, pale blue shirt. I'm using a damp brush here to absorb some of the excess paint because I don't want drips. I don't want it to blob up. And the trick that I've learned over the years is it takes a while to learn how to really control the amount of water in your paint mixture and how to really control how wet an application of paint is. But knowing how much to use and when and where, once you've got that, it just changes everything about your painting, and it makes everything a lot more enjoyable because it just starts working right. I've just realised that this orc here looks like an evil version of my granddad. He had kind of like a big head and a narrow jaw, and my granny used to call him a wee garden gnome. I did not intentionally do an evil version of Grandad Bill, but this is what I'm talking about when I say you can't always separate the art from the artist. Fortunately, my Grandad Bill was a very innocuous sort of a man who never did anything terrible. So there we go. As you can see, what I'm doing is effectively a wet on dry technique. It doesn't have to be all the way dry, just dry enough. And that's why controlling the amount of water in your mixture and controlling how much it gets applied is most helpful, because That allows you to work your wet on dry without having to wait forever for things to dry out, and it stops you having pools, which then have weird edges that they don't always work. You've got to know what you're doing with them. And even when you know what you're doing, it doesn't always work out quite right. So there we go. You see, I'm leaving these light areas. They're not white, they're just merely light red, pinkish. Kind of a greyish colour for his hair. I'll probably come back and I'll do his hair much darker than that. And right now I'm mixing a little bit of brown into the light blue colour of his shirt. And that makes a shadow tone for the shirt. There we go. That is going to need me to remove some. You can see, I can definitely see in camera. You can see that the paint is blobbing up a bit, and I don't want that right now. So rinse off my brush, wiping it on some kitchen roll, and then using that damp brush to just absorb that extra paint water. Probably just me being a bit too hasty. Right, and back on the yellow ochre. This time it's a stronger mixture of yellow ochre. Much less dilute. And you can see it's, as it's going on, it's got a lot more saturated yellow colour to it. It doesn't look like a washed out brown, it starts to look more distinctly like a yellowy colour. That's probably as intense as I want to go. And now I'm going to start using yellow ochre with added lamp black, probably. Lamp black is ideal for desaturating any mixture. It's not a perfect black, it's a browny black. Mars black, I think, is a perfect black. You know, it's absolutely neutral. Whereas lamp black is just ever so vaguely warm, which is what makes it my favourite. Here it is, I'm just getting some black. I think I've taken a whole lot of years off of this dude, giving him his black hair back. You're like an advert for a gentleman's discreet hair dye. But the skin colour is very monotone. And in real life, skin colours are not like that. There's always a variation. So, got my yellow ochre. Now, in the shadows, we probably want a cooler colour. So, got a little bit of ultramarine there. And to just move some yellow ochre over there. And yes, that does make a desaturated green, which is fine. Green turns up in pretty much every human skin tone, from the lightest to the darkest. There we go. So the variation of that basic skin tone. Now this brush is now loaded with just clean water, and I get just a tiny little bit right on the tip of my brush, a tiny little bit of red. What that does is, as I apply the red, and as I continue to brush it on, the clean water replaces the paint at the tip of the brush. Gives me a lot of control about how much paint gets applied at any one time. Gives me a lot of control over exactly how tinted the glaze gets. And if I find I have too much on my brush, because it's right on the tip of the brush, I can just wipe it off, bloop, 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 and then go right back to it. So I've got a slightly too much paint on the brush there. You can't see it yet, and I'm just going to add it, say, I don't know, tip of the ear here. So that's overly strong. I wipe off the paint, and now the damp brush will absorb the paint away from the paper, which will stop that from being overwhelming. There we go, and I can just layer by layer. People say that you can't layer watercolors. I have heard, and certainly when I was younger I believed that you could not. But I have come to learn otherwise. I have known otherwise for many years. You absolutely can. It's just a question of being careful with how dry the paint you're painting on is, and how much water is on your brush, how much water is in your paint film, stuff like that. Again, it's a matter of experience. My daughter is just starting to learn things like dancing and violin, things like that. When she gets frustrated because she's not advancing as fast as she'd like to, I can completely relate. I was exactly the same. I still am the same, really. Learning anything is just a matter of time served. Everything is a skill. Nobody's born with any skills at all. I try not to let people say that I am talented as an artist. For one, I don't think talent is something that truly exists. I have a level of skill. I am not the absolute master of all types of art. I'm not really the absolute master of any type of technique or material or anything. But I have a level of skill because I've been doing it for 20 years. And I have more technical proficiency than some, and I have less technical proficiency than some. Than quite a lot, if I'm honest. And in another 20 years' time, I will have more. So here's another thing that I like to do, is I like to make sure that there's lots of, especially for orc paintings, I like to make sure that there's lots of extra variations in tone that don't necessarily have to do with the changes in the plane of the face, so that it looks like blotches of different coloured skin on the surface of the skin. I think it's what's called local colour in proper technical painting vocabulary. Local tone, perhaps, might be the better word. Now, what am I going to do with the eyes? I don't really want to do them red, because I always do them red. They can't stay perfectly white, so I've just added a little bit of warm grey so that they aren't perfectly white. When that's dry, what will I do? I might do the secret dip pen technique. It's a secret. In the meantime, I should fill in that background with something. What I'm going to fill in the background with, I think, is I've got this yellow here, and what I need is to desaturate it a bit. And as always, that lamp black is perfect, so it just kind of makes it like a dirty yellow colour. Is this a good idea? I'm not entirely sure, but I am committed now, so I have to do it. I think it should complement the browny yellowy skin tone of the orc, and I think it should not be too clashing, too distracting from it. But I might be wrong. I think I might have been right. Yeah, go me. Now, I'm mixing up a brown here on my palette. Brown is a mixture of all the colours, yep, all the primary colours. It helps to start out with something like orange, yellow and red, and then add blue or black, because that makes it a desaturated orange, which is essentially what a warm brown colour is. I've made something that's roughly analogous to burnt sienna. I have a tube of burnt sienna, I have it right nearby. However, I am just a little bit too lazy to just go and get it, because I am a terrible person. And also because I didn't want to stop what I was doing on the video to then go and, look it out. I didn't think that would be good video. Now, that's a good kind of rich colour, but because it's so saturated, it's taking some attention away from the face. So now what I've got to do is I've got to add a bit more black to that brown mixture, making it quite a dark, earthy brown now. And this is actually a very dry mixture of paint. There's not a lot of water in this, so it's almost a dry brush. And I'm going to use this as a glaze for some other parts as well. That should help the face stand out again. Yeah. Because there was too much contrast between pale blue shirt and the, this brown over, I don't know what it is. It's an apron maybe. There was too much contrast there, so I had, center of interest, contrast. And that contrast was distracting from the center of interest. Can't have that. But now that I've taken this shirt down in value, and it's closer in value to this apron, now that I've done that, this whole area doesn't have so much contrast within it, and that means it doesn't compete for attention with this. Right, now I think the eyeballs are probably dry, so it's time for the secret technique. This is a Hunt 102 dip pen nib, and it's very, very fine. And I'm about to load it up with some very dark brown paint. There we go. Loading it up is as simple as just having some on your brush and then rubbing the brush on the dip pen. There we go. That adds a little more detail to the eyes. So that they're interesting, but without having to just do them as red. Great compromise. And then I can use the watercolor that's still loaded up in the dip pen. I can use it like as if it were ink. And I can use it to hatch in some extra areas. Adds detail, adds texture. Hopefully that's not a bad idea. Applying watercolor with a dip pen is unusual. Probably it's something that people have done for a long time. I'm just not aware of anyone in particular having done it. If you know somebody, some artist, who has done it a lot, then let me know, because I'd love to see their work and see if I can pick out the areas where they've done something a little different. Yeah, there we go. All right, I think I'm done here. I'd say that's a good painting so far. And I'm gonna not look at it for about a day, and then tomorrow if I hate it, oh well, too bad. Okay, everybody, have a nice day, and I'll see you very soon. Bye for now.